Deltarune is a game of many mysteries. From big questions like what happened to December Holiday and the true nature of Dark Worlds and Light Worlds, down to smaller things like what is Susie's home situation like. I think there's 100 little nieces that different players can latch onto in Deltarune, and it's one of the reasons why the game seems to have such a power for sticking in people's minds. My personal mystery that I keep coming back to when I think about Deltarune is something that's only really come into focus with the release of chapters 3 and 4. In this video, I'm going to kind of reveal my thoughts on this topic, and I'm not going to claim to give any definitive answers because I don't think it's a topic we can have answers to until the entire game is complete. But if nothing else, I hope to get other people thinking about it, because I think it's one of the more interesting and mysterious parts of the game so far. So, I'm going to start off by just going through some moments in the game and a piece of paratextual evidence as well to explain why I got fascinated in this topic. So, this started when I happened across the pre-order trailer for chapters 3 and 4 of Deltarune on the Nintendo Switch 2, on the official Nintendo channel. Something that really stood out to me in this trailer is the framing of all of the different chapters, as you can see here, and Deltarune itself waiting. This stood out to me as a really unusual usage of the language. It's not something you would expect to see in a video game trailer, you know? Like, the game is out, what's it waiting for? You know, just go and play it. But, trailers can do strange things sometimes. It doesn't necessarily mean much by itself. It can just be a mysterious, evocative tagline. Okay. Where things really got interesting, though, is when I actually played the game, and in Chapter 3, you encounter the Forgotten Man, as he calls himself, in the Chapter 3 egg room. And after you talk to him, he has this big long monologue, which is very interesting in its own right and such. But near the end, he says that if Chris wants to, they will meet again at that place, quote unquote. Whether 11 hours or 11 years, Deltarune will be waiting. Now, this is really fascinating to me because one instance of this phrasing, Deltarune is waiting, that's weird. Two instances of it, that is a pattern. And to me, it implies that we should be paying attention to this. That's especially given that the Forgotten Man is already one of those mysterious characters in the kind of meta-narrative space of Deltarune. Basically, everything he does or says is already important or interesting, and when he name drops the game itself, then, our ears should perk up. But, okay, maybe we should say that this is just some weird offhanded reference that we don't have to read too much into. But then, when we get to the end of Chapter 4, Mr. Wingding himself, the big guy, the one that everybody micro-analyzes every syllable of information we get about him, he straight up says, my Deltarune is still waiting, and he wonders how much longer it's going to have to wait. Not to put too fine a point on it, but what on earth is going on here? This is a really specific usage of language that has been deployed repeatedly and in some very important moments, You could dismiss this in a trailer as just something like weird marketing speak. You could dismiss the Forgotten Man encounter as an out-of-the-way Easter egg, something that 99% of players will miss. But this is mainline, unmissable content from arguably one of the most important characters in the entire franchise, directly saying Deltarune is waiting. So what on earth is going on here? I think this is a really, really clear sign that Toby, or the narrative, I guess I should say, is setting up this theme of waiting. And the question is, why is it doing this, and what on earth does it mean? So, To counter kind of the obvious initial reaction, I think a lot of people, when they see this, will just say, well, it's Toby like having a meta joke on us. He's saying, look, I know it's taking a long time for this game to get made, and that's why the Forgotten Man says, whether it's 11 hours or 11 years, Deltarune will be waiting. Because maybe it will take 11 years for Deltarune to be finished as like a game, okay? Now, I think that can be part of it. I definitely think that may be one reason why this phrasing is coming into focus. But I don't think it's the whole reason for a few factors. And I'll just briefly go over why I think we have to care about it beyond the level of a joke. So, on a very simple level, it would be a weird joke to make in a trailer, you know? If you're making a trailer to sell the game, and it's not a joking trailer, it's like a serious trailer that's epic and evocative, why would you make the joke that, hey, this game isn't finished yet and you'll have to wait like 6 years for the rest of it to be done? You know, that just seems unusual. There's a limit to how like flippant and ironic Toby is. In the same vein, when Gaster has his monologue at the end of chapter 4, um, it's a very serious moment. I mean, the music that plays there, Never Ending Night, it's not a joke track, it's deeply emotional. I mean, when I first experienced that moment, it was kind of a revelation, you know, it was deeply impactful. It is not presented as a joke, it's presented like Gaster is in awe of Deltarune, it's almost reverential, you know? Maybe it could still be the case that he is anxiously awaiting the completion of Deltarune, because for him, as a fictional character, the creation of Deltarune is of utmost importance. Okay, but maybe it is still just a reference to the game being created. But another factor is that we've already had an instance of Toby making this actual joke of, you know, I'm sorry this game is taking so long to get made, please just wait a bit longer. Because in chapter 1, when you're back in the light world and you go to the computer lab, you can see the annoying dog, which is Toby's avatar, obviously, and it is making a game. And when you interact with it a few times, it turns into a joke of, you know, the dog is playing the maracas, it's not getting any work done, and stuff like that. That is much more obviously coded as a joke, because Toby only really deploys the annoying dog figure as his own avatar when he wants to be a bit silly, or like make fun of himself, you know? So, this is what it looks like when Toby is making fun of how long he's taking to work on Deltarune, and it's very different than these three cases we've just seen before, you know? He has the Forgotten Man and Gaster, two of the most important people in the franchise, arguably, saying this. He does not have the annoying dog make this joke. Use this phrasing of Deltarune is waiting, okay? And finally, I just want to hammer home how weird and specific the language I'm talking about here really is. Deltarune is waiting. Now, he could have written it in a much more normal way, like Gaster could have said, we must wait for Deltarune, or how much longer must we wait for Deltarune? But instead, by saying Deltarune is waiting, it turns it into the active agent in the sentence, like on a grammatical level. It feels kind of strange, at least to me. That's why it stood out to me when I first saw that trailer. It makes us think things like, how is Deltarune something that can wait for things? That implies it's almost anthropomorphic, that it has mental states and desires. That's really deeply bizarre. Okay? Maybe you can dismiss all of this and you still just think it's a weird meta joke, or it's like Toby inhabiting the character of Gaster and the Forgotten Man momentarily. I could buy that, but I think it's a much more interesting to consider the alternative case, that this is leading up to something more important that will be revealed in the later chapters of Deltarune. So to start exploring that, I think we have to wonder, well, what is Deltarune, you know? Um, and obviously there's the simple answer that Deltarune is the video game that you buy on Steam for $25 or whatever. It's the actual lines of code. But I think there is enough material in the game to suggest that it's not as clear-cut as that. So, first things first, on a simple level, Deltarune with outer space does not seem to be the same thing as the Delta rune with a space. The Delta rune is an in-universe symbol. You know, it's the thing we saw in Undertale as well, that is the focal point of the religion of Hometown. Now, the fact that they have this symbol is obviously important, it seems significant, but we can probably justify it as just they took it from the prophecy that was, I don't know, written by Gaster, however you want to think about the prophecy. Okay. It seems to be the case that when Deltarune is written without a space, it refers to something different, something more metaphysical, something more important. Now, this isn't 100% consistent because I have this image here in the at the bottom that comes from the Valentine's Day letter, which we now know was written by the Forgotten Man, and it says, "Well, in any case, how is Deltarune?" And this time it's written with a space, even though he seems to only refer to this like game level concept of Deltarune rather than the in-universe prophecy. But this is the only instance I can find where it seems a bit confused. In all the other cases where Deltarune is spelled without a space, it seems to refer to something grander, more mystical about the nature of the world itself. Okay. Um, some minor points. By the way, all of these screenshots on the right-hand side of the screen, these come from the text dump of Deltarune, which makes it very easy to search through and find cases where Deltarune is used with one spelling or another spelling. I'll link that in the description in case you want to do your own investigation. So, as you can see here, we have the prophecy, we have the church legend, and they both refer to the nature of the world itself, the legend of the world, not just the prophecy, and that's spelled as Deltarune without a space. One of the really interesting cases, and I think the only other case where Deltarune is used without a space, is some in-battle dialogue, I believe, with the organic enemies from Chapter 4, where they say, "What is Deltarune? What isn't Deltarune?" This is really fascinating. It implies that they have some kind of deep knowledge of the game level itself. And I think that other quote you can see in the rightmost screenshot, it was glowing, the voice was glowing. To me, that refers to the dialogue of Gaster, because as you can see, it's kind of implied to be glowing in just the way it's presented in game. So that's mysterious on a very basic level, that these characters possibly know about Gaster and the depths layer and all of that stuff. But I think the basic meaning we're meant to take from that quote of theirs, what is Deltarune, what isn't Deltarune, is that Deltarune is kind of all-encompassing to them. It refers to everything. I think on a basic level there's a few things we can identify as this mysterious Deltarune without a space. One, as I've said, is the game itself. It's the actual application that you run. Something that is very similar but maybe distinct is it could be the name for Gaster's device, the quote-unquote device from the device theory, which he's using to connect us as a human being in the real world to this world of Hometown, so that we can inhabit the story of Chris and Susie and Valsay and so on, for whatever reason Gaster has to do that. Now, Gaster's device may be identical with the actual application of Deltarune that we buy on Steam. I kind of suspect it isn't, just personally. I don't really have a good reason for that. But yeah, it's not really too relevant. Maybe they're the same thing. The other option, which I don't think a lot of people have considered or spoken about, is that Deltarune could be an entirely new kind of entity or thing separate from both Gaster's device and the game itself. That may seem a bit arbitrary and unexpected because, okay, what is it? Why are we introducing this new element without any grounding? It seems like it would go against the principle of Occam's razor, But what I would say is there is precedent for this in this franchise, because think of determination in Undertale, When you play Undertale for the first time, determination is presented as just something in the flavor text that you see at the save points, and you come to realize that, oh, this is a theme the game has. Determination is something it cares about on a narrative level. That's cool. But then in the True Lab, you get that bombshell that no, determination is actually a metaphysical force within the game itself, within the universe of the game. It is something that exists and characters can talk about, you know? And I kind of get the impression that Deltarune is the same kind of thing. I'd have no hard evidence for this, really, but I get the feeling that maybe in Chapter 6 or Chapter 7 we will have some big bombshell reveal that Deltarune is some force or entity or process within the universe that the characters are working towards or generally aware of. I think the strongest hint we have to that is the dialogue of the Forgotten Man, where he says, "If you will it, we shall meet again at that place. Whether 11 hours or 11 years, Deltarune will be waiting." This is ambiguous, but to me it reads as if he's saying that Deltarune is a place that you can go to, which is fascinating. I don't really know what to make of that, but that feels like the most concrete hint we have so far as to the true nature of Deltarune, whatever that may be. So, now we have some options for what Deltarune might be. Let's go back to the original question of, okay, what is Deltarune waiting for? Because I cannot get that question out of my head. What could it be waiting for? The initial thing we can say is that it seems to be waiting for us, okay? In all of these cases so far, we, the player, are who is being spoken to, okay? So the trailer is speaking to us by convention. Gaster seems to be speaking to us. He's obviously aware of the player, or at least of the soul. The Forgotten Man is a bit more vague there because, in a direct level, he's speaking to Chris, it seems like. But, you know, he's one of those characters who lives in the metatextual space of Deltarune, so we can kind of take it that he's also speaking to us in, like, a form of innuendo, or, like, double entendre, you know? So, we have something, or we are something that Deltarune is waiting for. And this also implies that whatever Deltarune is waiting for, it can't do it by itself, you know, otherwise, presumably, it will just do it. So it needs something from us, it requires us, okay? And that's why I think it can't just be waiting for Deltarune the game to be completed by Toby Fox and his team. Because technically they don't need players to do that. They could just create the game, throw it on Steam, and even if nobody ever plays it, then Deltarune would still be complete. But that wouldn't really fulfill, I think, this notion that Deltarune is speaking to us, it's waiting for us, okay? So, frankly, we don't have any evidence for what Deltarune is waiting for, and so this is pure speculation, but my theory is that Deltarune, as a work of art, as a work of fiction, requires the player as a kind of active agent to fulfill its purpose, okay? Some kind of random thoughts on this. So, when you break down the word Deltarune, the term delta most obviously refers to the Greek symbol delta, which is used in, you know, engineering and mathematical context as a symbol of change, of things changing over time, okay? And rune obviously is a symbol. So Deltarune refers to a symbol of change, of being able to change things in the world. And who would that be? I think we can identify that as the player, because ultimately we are the person who drives the story of Deltarune forward. Without us, if you just booted up Chapter 1 and walked away from the keyboard, Chris Dreamer would just be waiting in their bedroom for the rest of time. Even if we buy into the fiction that Chris is a person with their own agency and their own history and their own future, ultimately we have to press buttons on the keyboard or the gamepad to make them move around and fulfill their future and stuff like that, you know? A kind of tangential thing, which I wasn't originally thinking about until I found this random dialogue in the Deltarune text dump, is some minor dialogue from Djevel in the Chapter 1, like, secret boss fight, where he says, "Who keeps spinning the world around?" And there's also the title of his theme, The World Revolving, which I've always found really fascinating. For one reason, because the song title is in all caps, and if you are gaster-brained like me, you know that things being in all caps kind of signifies that it has relevance on a device layer, on a game level, on a game layer, on a gaster layer even. And so it makes you wonder, what does it mean for the world to be revolving? And what is Drevel asking when he says, who keeps spinning the world around? Well, I think we can kind of answer that question. It's us. The world revolves around us because, as the player, we are the most important person in the world, and without our actions, nothing happens. Okay, we are the person who gets the world moving, kind of like putting our energy into a machine to start it up, like kickstarting an engine almost. And therefore, we are understood in the world in its religious context as this kind of divine figure coming down as an angel. And yes, I'm just equating the player with the angel. I think that's justified at this point. And we are using our divine energy to kickstart the forces of history and motion and time and space itself, even to just make things happen. Without us, without our force and our energy and our ability as real human beings to make choices and act, the world of Deltarune would just be an inert, motionless, stable thing. It would just be lines of code, essentially. Okay. Hopefully that doesn't sound completely insane, but that's my kind of grand theory on what Deltarune is waiting for. It is a reference to the nature of works of art, works of fiction, and I guess games in general, but I think it's more broadly applicable to fiction, as kind of engines that require the input of a human being, of an audience to place themselves into the work to give it a sense of life, of vibrancy, of motion. Okay? That's basically all I wanted to say. I think there isn't too much more to be said on this theme of Deltarune waiting at the moment because we only have these very few brief transitory references. However, I do really suspect this is going to come back up in later chapters. Um, I think that we are going to end up doing something to fulfill this kind of expectation Deltarune has of us. I don't know what that's going to look like, if it's just going to be us completing the game or seeing the end of the story or something like that. But yes, that's my opinion. That's my theory. I'll be really interested to see if I'm proven right or proven wrong, or if the game just never picks up this thread again in later chapters. But let me know what you think. Am I being completely insane here? Um, yeah, interested to hear what you think. Okay,